Hi everyone, this is Heather. I am Needle and Pearl on Instagram and Ravelry, and you can find my shop at needleandpearl.com. And welcome. This is maybe my first official video. I've played around with a few in the past, but this is really the first adventure into doing this more seriously with some longer form videos, I hope. So I've been wanting to do this for a while and just find a new way of communicating with those of you that we stay in touch with online, and just thought it would be kind of fun to do. So hopefully I get a little better at this as I go. Who knows, maybe not. But wanted to share on a few different topics, and I will try to post these in a couple of different places so you can find them. I'll try to post them to my YouTube channel and also to the blog on our website, Needle and Pearl, so that you can find them in a couple of different ways, and hopefully that will work well. Looking to do these on just a range of different topics that might be fun or interesting, things that I'm thinking about when I think about working with wool and yarn, and projects that I'm working on, and maybe some other fun topics too. If you have been following me for a while or recently, you know that we've just found a more permanent website for some of the products that we've been making, some for a while, some more recently. So maybe once in a while we'll do some shameless self-promotion here too, but mostly this is a place to talk about making and yarn and knitting and do some topics around that. So I have been knitting for not too long, maybe the past 7 years, I would say. I learned from my friend Valana, who taught me one Saturday. She taught a bunch of us friends. We had a get together at my house, and she offered to teach a bunch of us, and I think I'm the only one in that group who stuck with it. And I really immediately became kind of obsessed. So Valana and I like to joke about that she didn't know she was maybe creating like the knitting monster that I've become. But it's been really fun for me since then. And Valana, actually, you can sometimes find her bags. She makes beautiful project bags. She's an expert sewist, and sometimes you can find them in our shop as well. So I'm really glad that she taught me how to knit. I do not crochet yet, and I would really like to learn. I do a little bit of hand looming, but that's about it for other fiber crafts. I don't spin. I've been trying to avoid that because I know once I fall into it, it will be another really fun but expensive habit I won't dig out of anytime soon. So what I wanted to talk about today for a topic would be a question that I've been asked a lot lately through Instagram and people I meet and chat with, which is, how do I come up with combinations in projects for doing color work specifically with natural yarns? So I think when people ask me that, they're thinking about either small batch yarns like farm yarn, or naturally dyed yarn. So yarn that is dyed with natural materials, like farms that use different plant material that they find in the farm or that they acquire. Eco dyeing is another name for it. So how do you figure out, or undyed yarn, how do you figure out how to mix and match different farms yarns together where it's not a commercial yarn per se? So maybe there's a slightly different feel towards it, or people are concerned, like, you know, if it's not commercial, will it have as consistent of an experience? How do I know how to mix and match these yarns together? How do I make sure that naturally dyed yarn will be color fast in my project? And how do you figure out how to do all that? And I think it's a really great question, and I wanted to kind of talk about it today because I have done a bunch of projects now in color work. I'm definitely not by any means a color work expert, but I do tend to put most of my focus in making on wanting to knit with local wool as much as I can and support local farms in their efforts, and I love naturally dyed yarn too. So I think it's really a great question, and let's dive in. So I think the biggest thing, the lessons I've learned from doing it, is the three things to consider would be texture, weight, and swatching, which really would be the same thing you would think about in any project, right? but they play a little bit differently when you're dealing with small batch yarn and naturally dyed yarn. Not any better or worse than when you're dealing with a commercially dyed yarn or a superwash yarn, but just differently. And I'm wearing an example today that I think this might be one of my favorite projects that I've made. So I did want to wear it today. This is a free pattern too, which I think is really, really great. It's called the rullskridsko. I'm gonna link to it because I've said it wrong twice now. Rullskridsko, and I probably rullskridsko. I said it wrong like 4 times now. I will link to it. It's a pattern by Amy Christopher. She's Savory Knitting. And it's a free pattern, like I said. Has these really cool small geometric motifs, which I personally really like to do in Colorwork. I think it's really, really fun. And they run, they kind of start small, and then I'll try to hold this up a little bit bigger. They get bigger and make this great kind of X's shape, and then kind of get small again. It called for a DK. I ended up working it in sport. That worked out fine. I got gauge and I didn't have any problem with that. It was pretty flexible. I used 2 different farm yarns here for this that I picked up at New Hampshire Sheep and Wool in 2019. The brown color is a natural undyed. It's by Prado Delana, and it's called Charlotte. It's actually their sheep Charlotte. Prado Delana has a really, really big array of natural undyed wool. So if you want to if you love neutrals and you're looking for the perfect brown, the perfect gray or cream or oatmeal or marled, they have it in every weight imaginable, from sport weight through bulky, because they really carefully, a lot of times, select it by their sheep, or if they mix and match a couple of fleeces together to get the right brown or gray, they're very careful about how they do it so that they have this wonderful palette of browns and grays and whites. And now black as well. So this Charlotte is like a silvery brown color. It's really beautiful. It's a Romney, so it's going to have that kind of squish that Romney has, which is really, really nice. It gives a squishy texture. And then for the color work, I selected Iris Creek Farm, and this is called Crossbreeds of Iris Creek. So the tag didn't tell me fully which sheep are mixed in here, but it has Leicester long wool, and the long wool is going to give it a little bit of this halo effect. So long wool is a really different texture than the squishy Romney, but one thing that it will give is, good definition for color work for sure. It usually gives a little bit more weight and heft, but it will also give, in this case, this really beautiful halo, and that's what I wanted. I wanted 2 different textures playing together in the same sweater, and I wanted kind of a mohair effect in the yoke without the heavy heat of mohair that mohair can give. And I think that's the first fun thing about playing with, when you're playing with farm yarns, you can play by sheep breed and really get to experience the different textures that they offer that you don't in a superwash. When you're using superwash bases, and you get to experience the amazing dye work that's done on them, but a superwash base is almost always either merino or primarily merino, and it's been heavily commercialized. So you have that very even consistency. It tends to be really similar, and sometimes it will vary a little bit because of, maybe a little bit of cashmere in it, or a little bit of silk that gets added to the base, or a little bit of nylon. But otherwise it's pretty much the same. It tends to have kind of that slightly silky feeling. I think it's very smooth, and it gives that even texture, but it doesn't give you a lot of textural play. And so that's, I think, its biggest disadvantage. And it also doesn't tend to grab the stitches as well for holding color work together as a non-superwash, whereas wool in its natural state really wants to have its fibers grab together and join. And so I prefer non-superwash for color work because I think it just likes to grab and hold stitches, and it will allow you to work with 2 different textures that are really different. Like these 2 yarns are so different, but they joined together. I'll try to zoom in even though I'm wearing it so perfectly, in a way that I think they can only do because they're non-superwash, and it gave me this great effect. So again, both sport weights, but totally different, and I think that they worked really beautifully. The next project that I had that talks about, I think, the other component that's really, or maybe the other two components besides texture, I guess, that I think is really important, is mixing and matching weight and then swatching. And I've had some like funny things happen with weight that ended up being okay, but I thought, oh, this is not gonna work out okay. And I think, again, that's where using natural wool can really help. Natural being non-superwash, I guess. And in this case, the weights were pretty similar, but it reminds me of an instance where they weren't. I should have brought that one actually. But this is the Early Bloomer by Heidi Kermeyer, and I did it in 2 Wing and a Prayer farm yarns. And it's this really beautiful purple logwood, naturally dyed. This deep purple, which is Thelma and Louise. Thelma and Louise is usually, depending on the batch that's done year over year, I think it's usually a 50-50 wool mohair, but maybe the percentages can be different. Wing and a Prayer farm will usually tell you on the label. And then the white, which is actually, if you look closer, it's getting a little washed out here, but it's really a cream color with gold and green and a little bit of brown speckling. That's 100% Cormo from Wing and a Prayer farm. So technically both of these yarns are in the heavy DK to light worsted range, I would say. And again, sometimes depending on the year they're spun up, they might get classified as a worsted or a DK. But both of these are a little bit different. The mohair content in the Thelma and Louise makes for definitely a heavier yarn than the Cormo, whereas Cormo will be super light and bouncy. I've actually knit a summer sweater out of Wing and a Prayer farm's Cormo, and it's wonderful. It's almost like cotton, but better. Really breathable, really light, has really great stitch definition. I think it's a 2-ply twist the way they have it spun. But they are quite different. So they both gauge up somewhat similarly, but you can feel that there is a lot of difference because of the mohair. The purple is a lot heavier. But they worked together perfectly in this color work. They came together so well, and I couldn't have asked for it to be better. So I would say when it comes to non-superwash wool, don't be afraid to mix and match them. Try it in the swatch and see, and even if in the swatch you feel like, oh, this yarn looks a little bit thinner and this one looks a little bit thicker and I'm not quite sure, wash and block that swatch and see what happens, because sometimes in the bloom they will really grab together and be okay. The other sweater I have where they're really different, I actually did, one was an Aran weight and one was a heavy DK, and they worked out great. And they were significantly different, and you can't even tell now. And they've come together beautifully, and I've washed that sweater many times, and the color work looks terrific. You can't notice any gapping or any sloppy stitches at all. It's great. Swatching is also really important for all the reasons we all know about, but I think it's really important when you're thinking about, will it be color fast with natural dyeing? And there's a lot, I guess, that I could say about that. But I think really it is true that to some degree, you know, natural dyeing, just like dyeing with chemical dyes, is an art and a practice. And there's a lot you can do to make things color fast, and the yarn should be mordanted, which is a process that helps the color to adhere. And I'm not a color dyeing expert, so I won't get into this. But you know, despite that, with natural dyeing, some things that are used for natural dyeing are a little bit more color fast than others. I think I've heard that the yellows tend to be more color fast, both in the immediate and over time, but don't quote me on that. Indigo can be the trickiest. It can be color fast over time, but it can bleed even as you're working with it. I would only say in my experience, I found that some things can be, it's hard to exhaust the dye out of the yarn. So sometimes the really rich blues and purples and reds, The dyer may have washed that yarn a whole bunch of times to wash out the excess dye before they dry the yarn and sell it to you. And you may still be knitting with it and experience dye transfer on your hands. And then you wash and swatch it and discover that it's okay and it seems color fast, and then you knit the garment and wear the garment and it's also okay. And that has happened to me. And that was definitely the case with this logwood. The purple logwood did transfer onto my hands as I knit with it. It didn't, you know, make a super dark hand for me, but I saw some purple on my fingertips. I swatched it with this white because I was like, that's a pretty big color difference. Like, am I gonna have, you know, purple flowers? I needed to know. So I did a color swatch right away and I soaked it for quite a while. And when I dried my swatch, I also really rubbed it together and wore it around my wrist for a while with a rubber band just to see if there was any color transfer between the two yarns as well as on my skin, and there was none. So I felt pretty good about that as I was knitting it, and I didn't worry too much about what came on my hands. That felt more like there's just still some excess dye in the yarn that needs to kind of come off. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm gonna have white yarn when I wash this. And that's what happened. When I finished washing and drying this the first time, it still had a really, really slight, just a teeny bit of a sticky feeling to it as it was drying that led me to believe like maybe there's still a little bit more color to exhaust in this. I hadn't soaked it a really long time. I didn't want to take my chances in that first wash with color bleeding onto my white flowers. I thought maybe I should have, you know, is this gonna feel kind of heavy or sticky when I wear it? And when it was first completely dry for the first few minutes, I still thought, well, maybe it feels a little tacky, I'm not really sure. But to be honest, now that it's completely dry and I've been wearing it, it feels great. I haven't had any problems with it at all. Like wearing a pair of new denim jeans, I would say maybe there's a tiny bit of, you know, if I wear a white tank top under it, a tiny bit of purple color transfer to that tank top. But nothing I would consider excessive. I mean, I'll wear a new pair of denim jeans and not worry if that transfers a little onto a new white t-shirt, and I would say this isn't any different. And I suspect that as I wash it the next couple of times, the rest of that excess dye will finish working its way out. But it feels great. It feels really comfortable and soft and really, really good. And it doesn't feel, you know, it doesn't have a sticky or a heavy feeling. It feels just right and fabricy. So I think being comfortable working with natural dyes is part of understanding and knowing that process about working with something that it's natural, it's good for you. There's no harsh chemicals in here that are gonna be bad for the environment or that will harm you. Like if anything really unfortunate happened to this sweater, which I hope never happens, or this one, you know, if it went back into the ground, it would, you know, and disintegrated over time, it would basically go back to what it had started with and have no environmental impact at all. And I think that that's part of the reason why we like to knit with natural wool and natural materials, right? So it's great to know that about it, I think. And, you know, then you can kind of know too, sometimes when you wind a new skein of naturally dyed yarn or eco-dyed yarn, you'll see some of the colored powder kind of come off across your countertop. Like you might see some purple powder or some green powder. And that's nothing to be concerned about either. That I think is also just excess dye coming off in dried form. And without fail, every single eco-dyed skein I've ever wound has done that. And it has had no bearing on whether the color holds up over time. And some of these naturally dyed sweaters I've washed many times. So I don't know whether, you know, 20 years from now, will this be the exact same purple? I don't know. But do I think that some fast fashion t-shirt that I had in a color would be the exact same color and not fade over 20 years? Probably not. So I think I still feel really good about this lasting a really long time and being a beautiful garment to wear. Also, I think I would just add it's important, you know, I think we all know this, but not to overwash our wool garments. So I always wear a layer underneath them, and I try not to wash them too many times a season, as little as I can get away with, to protect the stitches and just the quality of the wool over time. So I'm always wearing, even with the short sleeve ones, layers underneath. So yeah, I think those are really the big differences, really for me, that you can get away with a little bit more ultimately when you're using small batch farm yarn that has not been commercially processed and is breed specific, sometimes even animal specific, you can just experience a lot more variety of textures, and you can play with those textures like with this garment, and not worry about whether you'll be able to get them to join together in the project, because the wool is really going to work for you and not against you. And I think that that's what makes it really special. You can really get experimental and have a good time with that. And I think also then you don't worry about it stretching or growing a lot like you do with superwash. You can wash and block these. In fact, you need to get them to bloom the way they should. And you don't worry about them growing a lot. I mean, I usually, it can depend. So sometimes I'll expect things to maybe grow anywhere between 1/2 inch to 1 inch. I don't tend to aggressively block unless I really fear I've made something too small. But they'll grow a little, but not a lot, because they haven't lost or become really super stretchy from the superwash process. So you can also feel good about, I made it in this size. I'd like it to stay at this size when I wash and block it. And, you know, I've made garments with Bromley and Shetland and mohair and Cotswold and I don't know, other fibers, and that's been true of all of them. You know, unless you introduce something like cotton or linen or some other random fiber, for the most part, and or unless it's really, really heavy, when you wash it, unless you're stretching it, it's really gonna stay pretty much the way you designed it to be. And I think that that's really great too. You get what you wanted out of it, and you don't worry about it going too big or too crazy. So the final piece I wanted to show is something that I'm working on myself as just kind of a fun little design of my own. And it's in 2 colors of natural undyed wool, just to kind of celebrate that in its own form with no dye at all, wool can be so beautiful to play with in natural colors. This is Yankee Rock Farms yarn. They are based here in New England, Colin and Siri, and this is their 100% Finn. Finn is a breed of sheep, and the texture of this yarn is so special. I don't know how to describe it. Cormo yarn has always been one of my favorites, small batch Cormo, and it still is, but I would say this Finn is really, it has almost a glow to it when you work with it. It's worsted weight, and I've got to double check. It's a 3-ply. It's really beautiful. They have it in natural gray and natural white. It's so soft but sturdy, has a shine to it, and here it is worked up in a colorwork cowl. And look at the silver effect, and then the white is so startling, so clean and beautiful. And there are lots of ways to dye gray, and dyeing gray is certainly not an easy task, and I applaud you know, indie dyers who do it. But I think when you have a natural gray that's this pure and this beautiful and this silver, you just can't replicate that. And the time and the effort and the attention that goes into a shepherd who cares for their farm in this way and their sheep in this way. The skeins were works of art when I received them, like so perfectly twisted, so beautifully clean. It's really just, I think, to take a minute and celebrate the work that goes into this. It's really something. So many great ways to do color work, so many wonderful ways to celebrate all the pieces that make up the fiber shed in our area. The shepherds who care for the sheep, the people who spin it, who dye it, who turn it into the skeins that we can purchase and use to make this beautiful yarn. So I hope this is kind of really super informal chat about working with small batch farm yarn and naturally dyed yarn was kind of fun and interesting to you. I didn't really keep any formal content because I'm interested to hear if you enjoy working with it too. Tell me about it and what you've done. If you're curious or have other questions, let me know. I've got a bunch of topics planned, so more to come. But just wanted to start out informally rather than a long introductory video. I thought I would just start with a fun chat about something interesting to me, and I look forward to hearing from you. I hope that you all are well. I hope that you enjoy taking a look at our site and what we're about, and I hope over time that we'll be able to introduce some of the farms in our area that I've knit with and worked with and just love so much, that we'll be able to introduce them to you more, and maybe do some work or collaborations with them in future. That really is kind of my dream for Needle and Purl. So I'm hoping to, do more and more with that as we go. And in the meantime, tell me about your projects and what you're working on, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.